Hospitals are full of secrets. I'd been a doctor long enough to know the strange stories, the ones shared in hushed voices at the nurse's station or over a quick cup of coffee during an overnight shift. But I never thought I'd become part of one. It was an ordinary night on the medical floor where I was working the night shift. Things had been slow, with only a handful of patients in critical care. I'd seen plenty of long nights, and when things were quiet, I usually welcomed it. I was heading to check on one of my patients, Mr. Peterson, an elderly man who'd been in a coma for almost 2 weeks. He was stable, but there was little hope of recovery. It was one of those cases where the family had said their goodbyes, and the staff had prepared themselves for the inevitable. I'd checked his vitals earlier that evening, and everything had been uneventful. Still, something nagged at me, a feeling that tonight was different. As I approached his room, I noticed something odd. The faint hum of monitors filled the air, but the usual routine sounds had a strange undertone, almost like a whispering, a faint murmur, coming from down the hall. I slowed my pace, straining my ears to catch any actual words, but it faded as soon as I stopped. I brushed it off as my imagination and continued to Mr. Peterson's room, mentally going through his chart to keep my focus. I pushed open the door quietly and stepped inside. To my surprise, Mr. Peterson was awake. He lay there, blinking up at the ceiling, his expression unreadable. His eyes, dull and glassy from his prolonged state, seemed to hold a spark now, a flicker of awareness. For someone who'd been in a coma for so long, it was startling to see him awake. "Mr. Peterson?" I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He slowly turned his head to look at me, and for a moment I wasn't sure he recognized me. Then, as if some clarity settled over him, he nodded, the barest hint of a movement. "Doctor," he whispered, his voice barely audible. "She's leaving us tonight." "Who's leaving, Mr. Peterson?" He looked past me, his eyes focusing on something just over my shoulder. I resisted the urge to turn around, feeling a shiver trickle down my spine. His expression was serene, almost peaceful, as if he was sharing some quiet secret with me. "She's waiting," he murmured, his gaze drifting back to the ceiling. I didn't know how to respond. I'd seen cases of patients experiencing confusion or hallucinations upon waking from a coma, but this was different. His tone, his certainty, it felt more like he was stating a fact than drifting through a delusion. I managed to regain my composure, making a quick note in his chart, but I couldn't stop thinking about his words. I tried to push it aside, chalking it up to the effects of his condition, but the phrase echoed in my mind, "She's leaving us tonight." I checked his vitals and administered his medication, trying to ignore the nagging feeling that something was wrong. As I turned to leave, Mr. Peterson whispered again, his voice as soft as a breeze. "She's here." I looked back at him. His gaze was locked on the door, his eyes wide and unblinking. I followed his stare, expecting to see someone standing there, but the doorway was empty. "Who's here, Mr. Peterson?" I asked, trying to keep my tone calm. He didn't respond, his gaze remaining fixed on the door. I took a step closer, hoping to snap him out of whatever state he was in, but his expression didn't change. He was staring into the empty hallway as if someone or something was standing just beyond the threshold. Feeling an uneasy twinge in my stomach, I backed out of the room, casting one last look at him before closing the door. His words lingered in my mind as I moved down the hallway. Back at the nurse's station, I found Linda, the head nurse, preparing charts for the next shift. I tried to shake off the tension, but the urge to share what I just experienced was too strong. "Linda," I said, trying to sound casual, "do you know anything about Mr. Peterson? Has he ever been lucid before?" She looked at me, frowning slightly. "No, he's been unresponsive since he was admitted. Why?" I hesitated, not wanting to sound overly dramatic. "He was awake just now, and he said something strange." Her expression shifted, a flicker of curiosity mixed with unease. "Strange how?" "He told me someone was leaving us tonight, and then he said, 'She's here.' He kept looking at the door, like he was seeing someone standing there." Linda's face paled slightly, and she looked down the hall toward Mr. Peterson's room. "You're not the first one to mention that," she said. I leaned closer. "What do you mean?" "There have been rumors among the night staff. Sometimes patients, those close to the end, will say similar things. It's like they sense something the rest of us can't. They say they see someone waiting for them. A chill settled over me. I'd heard tales of patients having visions, but I'd always dismissed them as hallucinations or the effects of medication. But there was a weight to her words, a sincerity that made it hard to brush off. Has anyone else on this floor mentioned it recently? Linda looked down the hall again, her expression unreadable. Room 217. The woman in there passed away last night. She told one of the nurses that someone had come to visit her, but when they checked, the hallway was empty. A shiver ran through me. I hadn't been on duty the previous night, but the thought of another patient seeing the same thing sent a wave of unease through me. Could it really be just a coincidence? Trying to shake off the unsettling feeling, I made my rounds, checking on the other patients. But as the hours wore on, I couldn't escape the nagging sensation that I was being watched. Every time I walked past an empty room or a shadowy corner, I felt an invisible presence, as if someone was lingering just out of sight. As I returned to the nurse's station, I heard a soft beep coming from one of the monitors down the hall. I checked my watch, 3:12 a.m. Most of the staff had gone home, leaving only a skeleton crew to manage the floor. The corridor stretched ahead, silent and barely lit, each step reverberating in the empty stretch. I made my way back to Mr. Peterson's room just to check on him again. He'd been in a coma for weeks, and after his sudden words about her leaving us tonight, I couldn't shake the feeling that something strange was unfolding. As I entered the room, I was met with an unexpected sight. Mr. Peterson was awake. Not groggy or confused, but sitting up, fully conscious, with the light of awareness in his eyes for the first time since he'd been admitted. A nurse was by his bedside, calmly arranging his pillows and checking his IVs, and he looked over at me with a faint smile. "Mr. Peterson, you're awake," I stammered, masking my shock as best as I could. He looked completely at ease, as though he'd just come back from a restful nap, not a prolonged coma. "Awake and feeling pretty good, Doc?" he said with a chuckle. "The nurses here know how to take care of you." I looked at the nurse, who nodded, confirming that everything had been checked and adjusted to make sure he was comfortable. It was routine for her, but something about this whole situation felt anything but routine to me. "How are you feeling, Mr. Peterson?" I asked, still taken aback by his rapid recovery. "Honestly, I feel like I've been asleep for ages," he replied, "but everything feels normal. Just feels like I'm waking up." He paused, looking at my face, and added, "Is something wrong?" It took me a second to respond. "Not at all. I'm just glad to see you awake. But do you remember anything from earlier tonight?" Mr. Peterson's brow furrowed. "Earlier tonight? I don't remember anything." "Why?" I hesitated, then pressed on. "You said something to me about someone leaving us tonight. Does that ring any bells?" He shook his head, looking genuinely puzzled. "Doc, I have no memory of anything like that." I told myself it was possible he'd been coming in and out of consciousness, maybe murmuring things that didn't make sense to him now that he was fully awake. And yet, the memory of his voice, so clear and certain, kept replaying in my mind. The rest of the night passed without incident, and after a few hours I returned to my rounds. When I came by Mr. Peterson's room again, he was asleep, looking as peaceful as anyone who had just emerged from weeks of unconsciousness could be. Around 5 in the morning, I was paged by one of the nurses from the ICU. A patient had passed away in the early hours, a woman in her late 40s, who had been battling a complicated series of health issues for months. As I scanned the notes on her chart, my gaze drifted down the hall toward Mr. Peterson's room, just one door over from the deceased woman's. The connection struck me like a jolt. She's leaving us tonight. Had Mr. Peterson somehow sensed what was going to happen in the room next to his? After her passing, there was a peculiar, quiet feeling that settled over that hallway, a feeling that lingered even as the hospital began to stir with the early morning routines of doctors, nurses, and patients. It was a heaviness, one I couldn't quite explain, as though something important had transpired in those quiet hours of the night, something beyond what the mind could fully grasp. I never spoke of the incident with Mr. Peterson again, and neither did he. When he was discharged a few days later, he seemed as sharp and clear-headed as anyone could be, offering no further mention of his strange prediction. But to this day, whenever I walk by that room, I remember that night and the words he'd spoken before he woke up fully. Was it just coincidence? Or was there something deeper, something neither of us could ever fully understand? I'll never know for sure, but part of me wonders if, in those liminal spaces between consciousness and the unknown, Mr. Peterson had glimpsed something I couldn't see, something waiting just beyond the door, hidden within the quiet hours of the night. Hospitals have a way of playing tricks on your mind at night. The sterile, buzzing environment is disconcerting in itself, but when darkness falls, it morphs into something entirely different, a quiet, echoing expanse that feels far too empty and unsettling. I'd been admitted for a minor surgery, nothing life-threatening, but they wanted me under observation for a few days, which was supposed to be routine. My room was tucked away at the end of a long hallway, isolated from the busier areas and far from the nurses' station. It felt peaceful at first, but as the hours stretched on, that solitude started feeling more like abandonment. It was on my second night that the uneasiness really started to creep in. I'd been drifting in and out of sleep, that hazy, half-awake state where sounds seemed louder than they should and shadows seemed darker. I heard footsteps in the hallway, which wasn't unusual for a hospital at night. But there was something off about them. They were slow, dragging, with long pauses between each step. I thought it was a nurse, maybe checking on patients with the quiet kind of diligence they use during night rounds, not wanting to disturb anyone. I turned over in bed, trying to ignore the sounds and get back to sleep, but I couldn't. The footsteps stopped right outside my door, lingering for a moment. I expected to hear the gentle knock or the soft creak of the door opening, but there was nothing, just silence. The longer I listened, the more unsettling it became. The presence outside my door didn't move, didn't make a sound. I looked at the clock, 3:07 a.m. I was just beginning to convince myself that I was overthinking things, maybe imagining it all. But then I saw it. A shadow stretched across the small sliver of light that seeped in from under the door. It wasn't a trick of the light. This shadow was clear, distinct, with a shape that looked human, but it didn't move like a person's shadow should. It just stayed there, motionless, as though someone was standing perfectly still right outside my door, watching. I sat up in bed, my pulse quickening, but still clinging to rational explanations. Maybe it was a nurse on a call. Maybe they'd stepped away from my door for a moment. But as I stared, the shadow didn't budge. I strained to listen, trying to catch even the slightest noise, but there was nothing. After a few moments, the shadow receded as if it was melting back into the darkness. In the morning, I convinced myself it had been a figment of my imagination. Hospitals and medication can play tricks on you, I reasoned. When the nurse came in to check my vitals, I casually mentioned it, almost laughing it off, but the nurse didn't seem amused. "Oh, you saw a shadow in the hallway?" she asked, her voice tight. "Maybe just one of the night staff on rounds." Her response seemed rehearsed, forced, and it left a strange feeling in my gut. I tried to shake it off and spent the rest of the day in a distracted haze, unable to fully relax. That night, when the lights dimmed, the tension returned. I watched the hallway with wary eyes, dreading the thought of seeing that shadow again. Midnight came and went, and for a while, everything was quiet. But at 3:02 a.m., I was woken up by the same slow, dragging footsteps. I lay still, my entire body tensing as I listened. The footsteps stopped outside my door again, and I braced myself, knowing what I would see. Sure enough, the shadow reappeared. But this time it was like it was pressing itself against the crack beneath the door. The air felt thick. I stared at the shadow, unable to look away, wondering who or what was standing there, and why they weren't coming in or moving away. Suddenly, the shadow shifted, as though whoever or whatever it was had changed its stance. Then, just as quickly, it melted into the darkness again, leaving the hallway silent. The next morning, I noticed the patient across the hall, an older man named Mr. Wilkes, talking to a nurse. I couldn't hear most of their conversation, but one phrase caught my attention, making my heart skip a beat. The shadow in the hallway. He'd seen it too. I knew it wasn't my imagination. There was something real lurking in the hallway at night, something that only showed itself in the dead hours when everyone else was asleep. I felt a chill settle over me as I looked back at my door, dreading the thought of another night in that room. When the nurse came in to check on me, I mentioned what Mr. Wilkes had said, hoping she might give me some kind of rational explanation. But her expression shifted, and she quickly dismissed it, saying Mr. Wilkes was on heavy medication and often hallucinated. But the way she avoided my eyes made me think there was more to it, something she didn't want to discuss. That night, I tried to keep myself awake, determined to catch the shadow if it came back. I kept my bedside light on, hoping it would be enough to keep whatever it was at bay. Hours passed and I eventually dozed off, my exhaustion overwhelming my fear. But at precisely 3 a.m., I was jolted awake. The room was silent, but the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, as though I was being watched. I turned my head toward the door, my heart pounding, and there it was again. The shadow, darker and more defined than ever before, pressed against the slim crack of my door, left slightly open. It seemed eager, almost as if it was trying to get in. I couldn't take my eyes off it, watching with a morbid fascination as it began to move, slowly gliding down the hall, only to pause at Mr. Wilkes's door. The shadow lingered there for a long moment, and then, to my horror, it passed through his closed door, disappearing into his room. I lay there, too terrified to move, listening for any sign of what was happening across the hall. But there was nothing, just an oppressive silence that felt like it was suffocating me. I barely slept the rest of the night, my mind racing with fear and questions. In the morning, I learned that Mr. Wilkes had passed away during the night. The nurses said he'd gone peacefully, that it was simply his time, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the shadow had something to do with it. I knew what I'd seen, and I knew it wasn't a coincidence. Later that day, I overheard two nurses talking in hushed tones outside my room. "It's always around 3 in the morning," one of them whispered. "And it's always the patients at the end of the hall. I don't know what it is, but it's not natural." Hearing that sent a shiver down my spine. This wasn't just a trick of the light or the side effects of medication. There was something in the hospital, something that only came out in the dead of night, and I was next in line. That night, I lay awake, my body tense with fear. I knew it would come for me, just as it had come for Mr. Wilkes. I watched the clock, my heart pounding harder as the minutes ticked closer to 3 a.m. I wanted to leave, to run out of that room and never look back, but I was too afraid to move. When the clock struck 3 a.m., the shadow appeared again, darker and more defined than ever. It slid across the hallway floor, creeping toward my door, and I knew there was no escaping it. I held my breath, watching as the shadow pressed against the thin opening of my door, almost as though it was testing the barrier, trying to find a way in. I could feel its presence, cold, filling the room with a sense of dread so strong it was suffocating. For what felt like hours, the shadow lingered outside my door, and then just as suddenly as it had appeared, it was gone, leaving nothing but silence in its wake. The next morning, I was discharged from the hospital. I left as quickly as I could, grateful to be free of that place. But even now, I can't shake the memory of that shadow, lurking in the hallway, waiting. And sometimes I wonder if it's still there, waiting for its next victim. I've been working as a night nurse for years. You see things, you get used to things, and then eventually you get used to being used to things, if that makes any sense. But every once in a while, something happens that sticks with you. I'm not a superstitious person, or at least I wasn't before this, but there's one night I just can't shake. Even now, it feels like it happened yesterday. It was a quiet night shift. There was an older man, Mr. Connors, up in room 216. He'd been admitted after a big stroke, and when he came in, he was already in a coma. The doctors were straightforward about it. He probably wouldn't wake up again. Honestly, he was just there, breathing on his own, but barely. A lot of people would just say he was existing, not living. Most nights I would go into his room to check his vitals, make sure his IV drip was good, and maybe adjust his blankets. He was a familiar part of my shift. I got used to the steady, faint sound of his breathing, a quiet rhythm that became part of my own routine. But there was something off about him, or maybe about his room. I can't say exactly what, just a strange feeling I'd get whenever I was in there. It's hard to explain, but sometimes it felt like there was a weight in the air, a heaviness that pressed down on me the moment I stepped inside. One night, it must have been close to 2 a.m., I was doing my usual rounds. The hallways were empty and dead silent, and I remember it being colder than usual. Hospitals are always cold, but that night, it felt bone-chilling. I was bundled in my sweater, but it didn't seem to make a difference. I remember my hands were actually shaking from the cold as I walked up to room 216. When I stepped into Mr. Connors' room, that cold hit me harder. It was like walking into a freezer. I shivered, pulled my sweater tighter, and told myself it was just the air conditioning. I tried to focus on my job, checking his vitals and looking at the monitors, but I couldn't ignore this prickling feeling at the back of my neck. You know that feeling you get when you just know someone's watching you? That's exactly what it felt like. I tried to shake it off. I didn't want to start imagining things in the middle of my shift. I leaned over Mr. Connors to check his IV, and that's when I noticed it. His breathing was so light, so faint, I had to lean in to make sure I was seeing it right. And then, out of nowhere, he moved. I swear my heart just about stopped. 1 second, he was lying there, perfectly still, and the next he was sitting up, staring right at me. It wasn't a gradual thing. It was like he just came to life in an instant, his eyes wide open and fixed right on mine. I couldn't move, couldn't even breathe. I felt like I was staring at a ghost. And then he spoke. "He's coming for me," he whispered, his voice hoarse and barely there. Those words hung in the air, heavy and cold. I tried to ask him what he meant, to ask him who he was talking about, but before I could say a word, his eyes closed and he slumped back onto the bed. Just like that, he was gone again. His breathing went back to that slow, shallow rhythm, and it was like he hadn't moved at all. I stood there, frozen, trying to make sense of what I'd just seen. My mind was racing, and I felt this wave of fear and confusion wash over me. Reflex, I told myself. It had to be some kind of reflex, maybe a last burst of energy. People say that can happen sometimes, but I couldn't shake his words, couldn't get his voice out of my head. He's coming for me. The way he'd said it, like he was sure of it, like he'd been waiting for this moment. I left the room, feeling this tightness in my chest, and walked back to the nurse's station, hoping the other nurses wouldn't notice how rattled I was. But I guess I must have looked a little pale, because one of them asked if I was okay. I nodded, trying to laugh it off, saying it was just the cold, that I was tired, but the truth was I couldn't stop thinking about it. After a few minutes, I forced myself to go back to check on him. I told myself I was being ridiculous, that it was just a weird moment, and I needed to get over it. But when I opened the door to his room, his bed was empty. My first thought was that maybe they'd moved him for some kind of late-night test, though I knew that made no sense. I checked the sheets, still warm, as if he'd just been there a minute ago. I ran back to the nurse's station, trying to keep calm as I asked, "Did someone move Mr. Connors?" They looked at me, confused. "Move him? What are you talking about?" one of them asked, and I could see the confusion in her eyes. "Mr. Connors is gone," I said, trying to keep calm, though I felt a panic rising inside me. They all stared at me like I was crazy. We checked the floor, searching every room, even the supply closets and stairwells, but he was nowhere. It was as if he just vanished into thin air. The more we searched, the more I started to feel that same cold creeping over me, a chill that went right to my bones. I kept hearing his words in my head, "He's coming for me." Finally, one of the nurses suggested we check the security footage. We gathered around the monitor, all of us tense, watching as the security guard rewound the footage from that night. And then we saw it. There was Mr. Connors lying in his bed, just like I'd left him. And then a figure appeared at the door. A tall man, dressed in dark clothes, slipped into the room, moving so smoothly it was almost like he was gliding. He walked up to the bed, didn't hesitate for a second, just reached down and lifted Mr. Connors out of bed, placing him carefully into a wheelchair he'd brought with him. There was something unsettling about his movements, like he was too practiced, too calm. We watched as he wheeled Mr. Connors out of the room, down the empty hallway, and out of sight. Not one person noticed. He didn't pass a single nurse or set off a single alarm. It was like he knew exactly what he was doing, like he'd planned it all down to the last detail. The police were called immediately. They questioned all of us, trying to make sense of how someone could just walk in and take a patient without anyone noticing. But none of us had answers. We were as shocked as they were. The footage showed everything, but there was no sign of them after they left the building. For days, there was no word, no trace of Mr. Connors or the man who'd taken him. The police kept looking, kept calling us with questions, but it was like they'd disappeared into thin air. I couldn't stop thinking about what he'd said, couldn't get those words out of my mind. He's coming for me. It was like a warning, like he knew this was going to happen, but how could that be possible? Finally, about a week later, the police found them. They tracked down the man in the footage, identifying him as Mr. Connors' son. Turns out, Mr. Connors had made his son promise years ago that he wouldn't let him die in a hospital. I guess he'd been afraid of hospitals his whole life, like those people who always say they were places where people went to die. It was a pact they'd made, and his son had come to keep that promise. They found them both in an old farmhouse a few towns away. Mr. Connors was weak, barely able to sit up, but he'd refused to go back to the hospital. He passed away 2 weeks later with his son by his side, just like he'd wanted. And as tragic as the story was, I couldn't shake the image of him sitting up in that hospital bed, looking straight at me and saying, "He's coming for me." It felt like he'd known all along. Doing hospital security on the night shift is already unsettling. Throw in strange events and it gets intense. I took the job figuring it would be simple. Keep the halls secure, do a few rounds each shift, and generally make sure no one was sneaking into the hospital. But the reality of it turned out to be something I hadn't expected. There's an eerie quality to hospitals at night, an intense stillness that hangs in the air. I told myself that it was all just my mind playing tricks, that the constant hum of the air conditioning or the flickering lights in the stairwell were normal. After all, any building this old would have its quirks. I was getting paid to stand watch and ignore those minor disturbances. That was until one particular shift down near the morgue. I'd never enjoyed being near the morgue. If I'm honest, I'd tried to avoid it as much as possible. But that Wednesday night, I was assigned to the basement level, meaning that every hour I'd have to do a sweep of the area, checking locks, doors, and making sure all was secure. The hospital was emptier than usual that night, with few patients and even fewer visitors. Just a couple of staff members wandering the halls on different floors trying to wrap up their shifts. At around 11 p.m., the basement was cold, unusually so. Hospitals are always chilly, but this had a different feel. A bone-deep chill that made you feel as if you were walking straight into a freezer. And then I noticed a faint flicker of light at the end of the hallway leading to the morgue. Figuring it was probably just another faulty bulb, I didn't think much of it at first. Still, I added it to my list of issues to report. As I approached the morgue entrance, the lights seemed to flicker again, this time pulsing as though they were synced with my footsteps. I forced myself to keep calm, pushing the unsettling feeling away. Flickering lights happen, the morgue is just a room. My thoughts kept spiraling like this, attempting to keep things normal. I was just doing my job. But then, as I walked past the main door, I thought I heard something, a faint, indistinct noise that I couldn't quite make out. It was almost like someone whispering. I stopped, listening. But all I heard was the humming of the air vents, so I kept moving, mentally telling myself to keep it together. But then, just as I took a few steps forward, I heard it again, clearer this time. A voice, low and weak, whispering, "Derek." I froze. I told myself it had to be my mind playing tricks. Perhaps it was just the wind moving through the ventilation system or a distant echo of a conversation from another floor. But it hadn't sounded like that. It sounded personal. Whoever it was, they'd said my name. I shook it off, or tried to. The hospital was just a big, empty building at night, after all. It's easy to imagine things. But the voice came again, and this time it was so clear, so unmistakable, that I couldn't ignore it. Derek. I took a deep breath, reasoning with myself. I was the security guard. I had to check it out, make sure no one was breaking any rules, no one was trespassing or doing anything they shouldn't. Slowly, I made my way to the morgue door and pulled it open just a bit more. The light inside was dim, but it illuminated the room well enough for me to see that it was, in fact, empty. But as I turned to leave, that voice came again, louder, closer. Derek, please. My breath caught in my throat. This time it was unmistakable. I wasn't imagining it. Someone was calling my name, pleading. Against every instinct screaming at me to leave, I walked further into the room, scanning the shadows, my heart racing as I took in every corner, every surface. Nothing was out of place. The tables were empty, the drawers were shut, and the silence was as thick as the walls around me. But as I stood there, I heard something else, a faint, rhythmic tapping. The sound was soft, but it echoed through the room, steady and constant, almost like fingers tapping against the metal drawers. I turned my flashlight toward the source of the sound, my hands trembling as I gripped it tightly, expecting to see something, anything. But again, there was nothing. Then, just as I was about to turn around and leave, I felt something cold, an intense chill, pressing against the back of my neck. It was as if someone had exhaled an icy breath against my skin. I spun around, my flashlight scanning the room frantically, but again, nothing. I was alone. Or at least I should have been. As I stood there, trying to steady my breathing, the tapping started again, coming from the far end of the room. My heart raced, every fiber of my being screaming at me to get out. But I was rooted to the spot, unable to tear myself away. It felt like something was holding me there, like I was meant to hear, to listen, to understand. The room fell silent. I was already on edge, and that silence made everything feel even more intense. I turned to leave when I heard a faint shuffle, somewhere down the hall, growing louder, like someone slowly making their way down the corridor. My first instinct was to brush it off as a janitor or another night shift employee, but something about those footsteps felt wrong. They were slow, almost hesitant, yet steady, each one drawing closer to the morgue room. They echoed off the tiled walls, bouncing around me, making it impossible to tell exactly where they were coming from. Then I realized the footsteps were heading straight toward me. I strained to hear, hoping maybe they'd turn, fade off in another direction, but they didn't. They kept moving closer. I didn't wait to see who or what it was. I grabbed my flashlight and backed toward the exit, heart hammering as I reached for the doorknob. The footsteps were only a few feet away now, right outside the door. I barely twisted the knob before I yanked it open and darted into the hallway. Once in the hall, I didn't look back. I kept moving, fast, not stopping until I was out of that corridor and back near the safety of the main floor. Only when I reached the light and heard the familiar sounds of the hospital's night routine did I pause, catching my breath. That night, I realized there was more in the silence of the hospital than I'd ever imagined. And whatever was down there in the morgue, I didn't intend to find out. When I finally calmed down, I tried to rationalize what I'd seen and heard. Maybe it was just my mind playing tricks, the stress of the night shift getting to me. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. I hadn't imagined the voice, the chill. Something or someone had been in that morgue with me, reaching out, desperate, trapped. After that night, I avoided the morgue as much as possible, requesting shifts that kept me away from the basement. But every now and then, I'd hear stories from other guards, tales of whispers, strange noises, lights flickering at odd times, and each time I'd feel that familiar chill, the memory of that voice calling my name. The last time I was assigned to the basement, I did my rounds quickly, keeping my head down, my footsteps light, not daring to linger. I don't know what was in that morgue that night. Maybe it was a lost soul, a spirit trapped between worlds, reaching out for someone to hear its plea. Or maybe it was just the building, the echoes of lives and deaths that had passed through its walls, lingering, hoping for someone to remember. All I know is that since that night, I've never set foot in that morgue again, and every time I pass by, I can't shake the feeling that someone is watching, waiting, hoping for another chance to whisper my name. If these stories kept you on edge, hit that like button and subscribe for more unsettling encounters. Turn on notifications because you won't want to miss what's coming next. Stay safe, stay aware, and remember, sometimes it's what you don't see in the hospital that should scare you most. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next nightmare.